Okay, well, let's look a little bit at the culture and context of the New Testament world, and we just kind of break that down in pieces. So let me get the screen to share here. There we go. So first of all, just speaking of the immediate context, talking about Greeks and Romans. Of course, it's important to recognize that at the time that we get into the story, the immediate context is the first century Mediterranean world. And so here in this picture, you can see that part around the Mediterranean that's ruled by the Romans, the Roman Empire. And that's kind of taints what we encounter in the stories. Very important, right? So, but in general, the environment of early Christianity, it's influenced by Hellenism, that's the Greek culture, the Roman Empire, it's Roman, and also by Judaism, because that's really like the story of God coming out of the Old Testament here. So on the left side here in the picture, you see a scene that you often see in pictures. It's a little bit anachronistic, which means not in order, but that's what you call the Western Wailing Wall. It's a wall that remains from the Second Temple, Herod's temple that he built, where we see a representation of Judaism. On the right side, you see a pillar actually in a synagogue that's up in Upper Galilee, where Jesus really frequented the scene in Capernaum. But you see the inscription there. It's a Greek inscription, so it's very interesting, right? It's a Jewish gathering place, a synagogue where people pray and gather, but it's more like a community place. And then you see Greek inscriptions. So all of this has to be considered. If you only focus on the Jewish background, the Old Testament, you don't really get the full understanding of the New Testament story. If you only focus on the fact that it comes out of this Greek world, you don't really fully appreciate it. And if you only remember that the Romans were ruling, you don't really fully appreciate it. You got to get the full picture there, okay? So be reading about that in your textbook. So speaking of Hellenism, the interesting thing is that the reign and rule of Alexander the Great really wasn't that lengthy. His father, Philip of Macedon, of course, had conquered quite some territory in Macedonia. And then his son took over and, was able to beat the Persians, which was quite a feat. I mean, that was a long-lasting empire. The part where he really reigns and rules in Palestine is even briefer, right? It's just a number of years. But the influence that came from that, we call it Hellenization, Greekizing, that lasted 1,000 years. So no matter who ruled after that, that all was subject to that. So notice that it's in the 4th century BCE. By the time we come on the scene, it's the 1st century AD or CE, and there's still that Greek influence, okay? So in terms of religion, that affects that. So we have the pantheon, if you will. So it's like the family of Roman gods, but it's very much so influenced, of course, by the Greek gods. So you often encounter Roman gods having Greek names and Greek gods having Roman names. So this is a picture of the pantheon that's actually built a little later, but that's really just representative of this body of Greek gods. So when you later on in the New Testament, when you hear of letters being written to Rome, you got to realize that these people didn't necessarily think in ways of Jewish culture per se. These are people that were embedded in a culture that believed that all the affairs were ruled by the gods, and so sometimes people have like discussions about predestination and is it in the Bible? Of course it's in the Bible. Everybody believes that all the affairs in the universe were ordained by the gods, and the only difference then becomes like, is it the gods of the pantheon or is it the God of Israel that's doing it? And so all these writings, of course, they support predestination. You can't really derive your theology from that, but is that really the way that God functions, or are we reading just the culture and context of the world that the story comes out of? Another aspect is domestic religion, like the religion in the house. Here you see a picture of an entrance, and there's a little capture here, a little area there where you have little house gods that would be there, and people going in and out with Greek little house gods that would protect the house and would bring goodwill upon the business of the people that would live there. That's very much so something that was just an integral part of society. Everyone was religious. It's not like you could separate religion and culture. Everyone was religious, even in the way that they would do their meals. And then there's this idea of the imperial cult, right? So it's not just Hellenism; it's also the Roman Empire. So you get what we often call Greco-Romans. The fact that the Roman culture was influenced by Hellenism, Greek, Greco-Roman. So now you get all these emperors, and these emperors worshipped these gods of the pantheon to have goodwill for their affairs, right? But at some point, people also start venerating emperors that have passed on. And then eventually you get what's called apotheosis, where they even start venerating these emperors while they are alive, as if they are godlike. And at some point, it kind of evolves into even bringing homage to the living emperors as if they were goddess. So they build temples and all that. That's often the backdrop to what's going on in the New Testament. So speaking a little bit about these Greco-Roman gods, they believe that on Mount Olympus, that's where Zeus lived with, pretty much his family of the gods, and that he was kind of like the upper god. So on one hand, you could say that they weren't organized, and on the other hand, there's kind of like this idea of Zeus and the Olympians living on top of this mountain. And then, in the book, there are descriptions of the perception of what these gods did. They were all very territorial. They had different realms and different jobs, just like in the Old Testament, there were different realms and different jobs. And so it's going to be quite interesting to see how Jesus is perceived as bringing this idea of the kingdom of God, that God reigns and rules in communities that could be anywhere, that could be taken around the Mediterranean. Wait, because Poseidon would be the god of the sea. He doesn't leave the sea. You don't find him on a mountain, right? So how is that going to work? How is it going to work when Jesus sends out his students to go everywhere on behalf of him? Well, then is God going to stay in Israel? Is he coming with them? So it kind of challenges the way that people think, right? Can you imagine? So familiarize yourself with these gods to have some frame of reference. Now, overall in society, you get this idea of Roman society, and it was kind of starting to get built and shaped around this idea of law and order, right? And they developed traditions, just like the Greeks had. For example, incorporating this life with the gods, they would begin and end meals with food to the gods. Interesting, right? How Christians like to start meals with a prayer of thanks to the God of Israel to indicate that they're separate from that. And then, like I said, a shrine to the god at the entrance of their home. But overall, there's this idea of communal life. And so when Jesus comes on the scene and he proclaims the kingdom of God, it's like an antithesis. It's like an alternate sort of idea. It truly is a commentary. And then there's that imperial cult, right? Where if you wanted to be a good citizen or deemed a good citizen, you would honor the emperor, even to the point that sometimes he was deemed divine. And when we get to the end of the first century, in some areas, in some pockets of the empire, not everywhere, sometimes there was a little bit more of an enforcement of that. For one, to create loyalties and to have some subordination and to keep the empire at peace. We call it the Pax Romana, the peace of Rome. And otherwise to just bring some well-being or what they believed blessings of the gods. And so if you became a Christian, a Jesus follower, at some point you had a problem, right? Were you going to be loyal to the Christian ideals and to God, or were you going to be loyal to the emperor who you believed was not divine? So that's kind of the backdrop there. We got some paintings here because we also deal with this idea of philosophy, especially out in the Eastern Mediterranean part and over in Macedon, in Greece. We have this idea, of course, of Greek philosophers. For example, the Stoics and Epicureans. The Stoics that control over their emotions, and the Epicureans who believe, just live life the way you want, a little bit of the absence of pain. And Some of our later documents in the New Testament have some traces of either combating some of those teachings, or maybe even when you read some letters by the Apostle Paul, you can see some overtones of using some of these concepts to reach people where they are. So very interesting. Some social features, the way that people interact within the community and with one another, are very interesting. For one, people really focused on group culture. And when you have group culture, some other dynamics become apparent, like honor and shame. So the people were not very individualistic. Okay, we as Westerners, we tend to really emphasize the value of the individual. Okay, so we ask kids, like, what do you want to be when you grow up? That's really not a question that you would ask as someone who is part of what we call a collectivistic society, a group-oriented society, because you become what your group is. It's just predetermined. And to want to step outside of that would be considered being disloyal to your group. And in that case, you would shame your group. So there are these dynamics of honor and shame. You always honor your group, and you make sure that you don't shame a group. In fact, especially the males of the group at that time, were in charge of preserving the name of that group, the family name, the name of the town, the reputation of the town. And women, sadly, because it was a patriarchal society, they often were a liability because they could bring shame upon the name. So honor and shame dynamics. They believed that honor was in short supply, so they were always combating for honor. Patron client was definitely kind of an economic sort of concept, where you had people that pretty much like a lifelong sort of employer would take care of people underneath them, and they were clients. They had like a lifelong loyalty. So imagine that the very first job you ever had would be a lifelong job. You were forever loyal to this patron, and the patron would take care of you. And you start seeing these concepts in the Bible where God is kind of presented as a benefactor, as a loyal patron. And so in turn, then the followers of God follow as a loyal client. You know, sometimes people say like, well, I don't understand this idea of grace that God brings. And God accepts people as they are, a central tenet of Christianity. Why don't people just kind of run off and do their own thing? I mean, if God always forgives, why would you behave? Well, because it's kind of built in that cultural understanding of that if a patron does something good for you, then you owe that patron your loyalty. So it's understand and built in that out of a sense of gratitude and pleasure and honestly dignity, you just don't do that. Okay? Kinship. This is the idea of strong family bonds. That is very much so a part of the world that the story comes out of. Kinship would be family bonds to the nth degree. It's not always true everywhere that we are from. In some places, it's not as much emphasized. In other places, it is. I married into a Southern family where that certainly is something that we have. But it's very strong kinship, to the point that if you are somehow related by some drop of blood, you owe that group your loyalty. And so Jesus actually, when you start reading the Jesus story, actually uses this social value as a way to explain how the community of God works. They actually start calling each other by what we call familial names, family names, kinship names. They start calling each other brother and sister. They're not even related. But they say the closest that we can think of strong community bonds would be to call each other by family names. And then economics. Economics were done differently. Sometimes I get a little bit nervous if, like in business courses and business concepts, we use modern day economics. You see, you cannot really find socialism or capitalism or any kind of isms in the Bible. No. You have to go back to the first century, where people believed that everything was a closed universe, a closed system. There was only so much to go around. So that if somebody a little bit down the hill had a good harvest of the crop, then somebody else must have had a not so good harvest of the crop. I know that sounds weird, but they believe it was a closed system. Limited goods, limited supplies. So you never really just gather it in. Jesus actually gives examples of that in stories. This is not proper, because if you have more, then somebody else has less. Okay, so this idea of limited supply is definitely there. And then the idea of purity, this idea that there are designated places for items. You think about it, what is dirt? Dirt simply is matter out of place. Soil is not dirty. It's out in the yard. I'm looking out of the window here. When it's out in the yard, it's perfect. But when you bring that soil in at the bottom of your shoes into the kitchen, now the kitchen is dirty, and the only difference is where the soil is at. So dirt is matter out of place. And the Jewish people and the culture of the first century, and even some of the Hellenistic culture, they had very precise ideas of where things belonged. And when they were all in place, things were pure. And if they were not in place, they were impure, they were defiled. And so when you read the story, you'll find out that some people don't want to touch other people because it was deemed out of place. And so keep that in mind as you try to understand the stories, that there were different degrees of purity. And so that's where we will stop the recording for now.